Hello and welcome everybody to the Finland Food Chain series of webinars. And today I'm wearing two different hats. I work with both the Finland Food Chain as the project coordinator. My name is Stefan Meyer. And I also work as the farm manager for the North Shore AgroEcology Center. And that is what we're going to kind of be focusing on today. It's just our work over the last few years here as we develop a piece of land that was ill-suited for agricultural purposes and trying to turn it into a perennial food forest and within kind of a diverse, small-scale farm, but also or you could say an upscaled homestead, because they can kind of apply to both. So let's see, we'll let Cindy here jump in and kind of introduce herself real quick before I jump into a presentation. It's basically a picture-heavy presentation, so you get lots of image ideas. So take it away.
All right, so I am Cindy Hale. I am the producer and producer, education, and infrastructure coordinator for the Finland Food Chain Project. And so my job is to kind of be that interface person for producers on all things education and infrastructure, which, that's not a whole lot, only everything. Stefan, why don't you take it away?
Let's go ahead and jump into it. Okay, and our first slide, the Finland Food Chain. So there's our website there, thefinlandfoodchain.org. Again, Stefan Meyer, I'm the project coordinator. If you have any questions, you can email me at friendsoffinland.org. And our mission is pretty simple. It's cultivating a thriving local food economy by facilitating funding and resources to build knowledge, skills, and infrastructure for ourselves and future generations. And that's also then our vision is an interrelated local food system where the community collaborates. So the other component of this, my other hat I'm wearing today is, so this is the North Shore AgroEcology Center, which is a project of the Organic Consumers Association. That's a organic food consumer advocacy project. They've been around for several decades. They're actually located here in Finland, but they're a national organization. They have lots of different campaigns, and you can read all about them at theorganicconsumers.org. And so the North Shore AgroEcology Center is their second on-the-ground farm project focused on regenerative agriculture. Their first project is actually located down in San Miguel in Mexico. So that's a pretty awesome project too. And again, you can find information on that project down there in organicconsumers.org. But if you have any questions about the North Shore AgroEcology Center, feel free to also email me at that. But you can email me at whatever hat, it's okay. Both hats get checked frequently. Okay, so let's begin. So the North Shore AgroEcology Center, this is our land. It's up here in Finland, Minnesota. It's about the 10-acre parcel on the right-hand side, and then on the left there is the 1.5-acre parcel, which will be the future center and education center. We have a nice barn that we were working on renovating over there. That's where lots of classes and workshops will be held. This is year 4 of the project. This was the year we were really going to start doing some good on-site classes and workshops. As we all know, that reality changed for us. So we just continued to work on land development this year and giving small personal tours, but nothing big on the education and workshop front. So most of what we're going to focus on is actually that eastern 10 acres. And so they purchased this about 5 years ago, and with the intent of trying to do some regenerative agriculture on kind of a typical landscape up here in northeastern Minnesota. It's kind of deciduous woods there in the north 2 acres. The south 3 acres is basically a cedar swamp, which will remain wild, has a beautiful creek running through it. But most of our intensive work is that big central area right there in the middle. Can you see my little pointer when I run it over it?
I can see your little pointer, so I'm hoping the others can.
I'm going to use that pointer to talk about it. So we'll be talking about this. It's about 3.5 to 4 acre area in here that we've been doing a lot of work on. And the history of this land is that the previous owner had decided at one point to try to put housing in here because this is all zoned residential. This is in the heart of Finland. So this is downtown Finland here. They had come in with bulldozers and scraped that whole area and taken all the woods down and basically had left subsoil, like very acidic, rocky subsoil that they were going to build on. That project never happened. And over about a decade, this area was reinvaded with grass and shrubs. And so that was what it was like when we got it. And you'll see in a later picture that up here, there's actually Silver Hill, which the name is named after. And this whole area is part of a seepage. And certainly once they pulled that soil down, down to the subsoil, so this area now basically was a swampy seepage through the end of June, even into early July, depending upon how wet the spring was and how much snow we had. Obviously not the kind of environment for growing most anything, especially lots of fruit trees and nut trees, which don't like their feet wet. And also don't like real acidic soils. So the goal was through the method of earthworks and creative soil building, to actually turn this into a verdant Eden. That's still in process. It's a long-term vision. But we'll go through what we've gotten done in the last 4 years here today and hopefully inspire some ideas for you all. So this was the vision. This is basically, again, this is that all going to fit in this little open area here. The idea was we do have a deep winter greenhouse, which you'll kind of see a little bit later. That's up there. That was built in 2016 in conjunction with the University of Minnesota. Followed that, surrounding that, we were going to do some herb terracing, beds, and this is basically a berm and swale drainage system. So that's very different. Typically, swales are used on contour in order to capture and hold water. What we are trying to do is to move that water and lift the soil so that we actually had the water table was lowered just a little bit. And then we had, the idea is to have a series of ponds. So like a small catch pond here, another small catch pond here with a large pond at the end of it to capture as much, because we didn't want that water to leave the landscape. We just wanted to kind of redistribute it. And so the big pond was supposed to happen last year and didn't, but the rest of this system is currently in, and you'll get to see pictures of that. So we'll just kind of dive right in.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to start with this question of what is hugelkultur, because I'm about to really talk a lot about hugelkultur. So hugelkultur is hill culture or mound culture. It's literally a raised garden bed that's built from the bottom up with logs, sticks, branches, wood chips. And then on top of that is a mixture of nitrogen, which would come through grass clippings, manure, leaves, food scraps, eggshells. Basically, hugelkultur is creating a raised bed, like a raised compost pile, but it's intended for growing vegetables in. And I've kind of taken that and applied it in slightly different ways throughout this system. And we'll kind of get to see some of the results. So those, if you remember, around the, let's see, did I actually pass a slide here, computer? Okay, so basically the greenhouse when it was built was backfilled with a whole bunch of gravel. And so basically we had a big slope all the way around the greenhouse that was hard packed gravel. And resources up here are very minimal. It's hard to come across good soil. It's even harder to come across compost and composted manure without basically bringing it up from Duluth. There are very few sources, and it's expensive due to the travel. So I tried to figure out what we had on hand and how to use the resources most effectively. So you can see here in the middle of our green area, we had a big pile of wood the previous owner had left after they had chopped down a whole bunch of trees. It was partially rotted. It was probably 2 to 3 years old at the most, just sitting there. Tons of big tall grass, great nitrogen source. And so putting those two together, what I basically started doing was using tamarack logs and creating a terraced bed system here, which I then put down, as you can see here, I put down logs, then covered them with a real thick layer of grass, then put a thin layer, about 3 to 4 inches of both soil and manure kind of on top of the grass to kind of seal in that grass so that as it decomposed, the nitrogen would be released into the system. And then this is what happens. So I cover crop them, and the idea of cover crops is that the living roots basically really start to help that process of bringing it back to life, of getting life and organisms into that hugelkultur mound, to help the mycorrhizal fungi start to grow on those roots because they'll also help to break down that wood. And the idea is you want to grow nitrogen. So there's a lot of clover, which is in the summer of 2018. This was a mix of Alseek clover and sweet yellow clover that just filled all the terraces. And they, you know, again, what they're doing is they're fixing nitrogen. And instead of letting them go fully to seed, what I would do is let them grow real big, get a lot of biomass, then I would mow them down. And by mowing them down at the point before they actually go to seed, that nitrogen then is released into the soil matrix as the plant roots kind of decompose. Now, a lot of this clover actually then is a kind of a perennial clover that can handle mowing, so it just actually regrew, which was pretty amazing. And of course, our bees just loved it, especially the sweet clover, but they definitely went after the Alseek clover too. And so again, the idea here was to actually build, eventually this was going to be turned into a herb terrace, a medicinal and culinary herb terrace, which we'll get to see here. And of course, designing in beauty. I love working with stone and wood, and I had a source of tamarack logs and plenty of rocks, which basically made up about 80% of our soil as we worked it. But again, I think, you know, I think beauty is really important. You know, whether on a farm scale or a homestead scale, things that inspire us as we're, you know, bending over and pulling weeds all day long is actually really a wonderful function in a landscape, according to me.
I agree. When I started farming, I farmed with a woman who had been farming for many, many, many years, and she had a very pragmatic perspective. You know, if you can't eat it, then why are you wasting your time on it? And I put in a small bed of flowers, and by the end of the season she said, you know what, the flowers were really nice. I think you're right, we should have some flowers too. So I totally agree that beauty, and plus, you know, flowers feed bees and butterflies and everything else too. So yep.
Yeah. And it's inspiring because farming and working the land is hard work, as many of us know that do that. So, and so then I think we pop ahead now to Hugelkultur herb terraces. This was this year. So late last year and then this year, I've been putting in a whole bunch of perennial herbs. You can see them all listed. Those are all the herbs that are currently in the herb terrace. So, you know, as of spring of 2017, this was hard-packed gravel that probably wouldn't have supported much of anything, to 4 years later with basically logs, a little bit of soil and manure and grass, and then just time, because it takes time for nature to really begin its process. I've basically not added any fertility to these beds since then. Whereas I have added, as we'll see when I made it berms, I definitely added fertility and soil amendments there. But with the herbs, I intentionally just went with what the soil had. And I'd sprinkle, I think this spring I sprinkled a little bit of composted manure on the top of the beds. But again, it's a vital resource and it's a limited resource up here. So they got a scant 1/2 to 1 inch at most on the beds. And it's been just filled with bees and butterflies, and it's been an absolutely wonderful treat this summer. So that's one example of what can be done with limited resources in a pretty harsh pre-existing landscape. Okay, so now going back to that vision again. So again, that was the, let's see, where am I here? That was the greenhouse, there we go. And those were the herbs around there. And the next area we'll look at is we also wanted to create a bunch of garden beds along here. And again, that soil was very, very hard packed, rocky. And down there, I didn't want to even try to dig into the soil. And so I was once again going, where do I get resources to build these beds? Because I'd used up my big pile of logs. I did have some wood chips available. We could chip them out of our forest, or we could collect them from some other local areas. And then I fortuitously ended up chatting with the North Shore Winery in the fall of 2017, and discovered that they had, every year, they have about 10 to 12,000 pounds of grape mash that they were throwing in their dumpster at that point in time. And I said, okay, 2018, we're going to change that. And we're going to take those and we're going to see what we can do with it. And they were very concerned that they didn't think you could compost them because the grape mash is highly acidic. And I was like, don't you worry about it. Me and nature got this covered. So this is that process. So this is the fall of 2018. We would go up there and pick them up with we did about 5 trips with the grape mash. It was a mix of, there was Cabernet, there was Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, Merlot. So it was a good wine blend. And I always love good reason to go to a winery. But basically what we did is we used wood chips and the grape mash and did like a lasagna style composting windrow. Again, this is just another style of hugelkultur, but instead it's all being built up on top of the soil, and I'm just using wood chips. I'm not using logs. And then, of course, what I did as part of this process to help with the acidity, I did lightly sprinkle some garden lime in every layer. And then as part of my ingenious idea, which I had no idea if it was going to work at the time, I inoculated the pile with wine cap mushroom spawn, which I just thought was, poetic. But if you're not familiar with wine cap mushroom spawn, you can get that from Field and Forest. They're a great source over in Wisconsin. That's a great mushroom company. And it's a type of mushroom spawn that is really aggressive, can basically eat lots of different types of wood chips. You can even do it on straw and it'll produce great mushrooms. Some people say they're not the most delicious mushrooms, but they're very ambitious, and you can get a lot from a little area. I personally like them, and I enjoy eating them. And again, I would take a chanterelle any day, but sometimes those are in short supply, especially this year. So moving on, so in the summer of 2019, that was my first berm. So this is its first full season. It was a pretty dry season. I didn't water it at all. I pretty much just let nature rain on it when it could. And then come spring of 2020, this spring, it burst forth with wine cap mushrooms. That's what all of these are. More than I could even begin to possibly harvest. And so because they had burst forth, that tells me that they had really invaded that pile. And so then in June of 2020, just earlier this summer, I decided to test it to see how well the soil was coming along. So I planted some butternut squash in there. I think there were 5 or 6 plants. There's a couple up here and a few more back there. And I just did a random sprinkling of cover crop seeds just to see what would happen. Because in the end, that's what's gonna tell me, nature's gonna tell me when this bed is actually ready and when it's composted and it's releasing nutrients. And so that's what it did. Without an ounce of water, and we're kind of in a semi-drought this year here in Finland. We've had just a couple inches a month at most since spring. And so these have basically they've got about 2 inches of water since early July, and I just took these pictures the other day. So the butternut squash is going crazy. I have buckwheat and phacelia and turnips and a bunch of other cover crops in there. And without any water, no fertility, they're looking great. They're looking green. They're growing amazing. It's pumping out butternut squash like crazy. Crossing fingers, if I get another month without a frost, I might get butternut squash, but I don't really expect that. We're kind of in a frost bowl here at the AgroEcology Center. We had actually it was probably about today, the last year, we had our first kind of hard frost here in Finland. It can be brutal. And of course, as an interesting side note, I discovered this year that the grape seeds were starting to germinate, and there were actually grape plants growing out of my compost pile. none of them will survive the winter here. They're not hardy for this kind of a zone. But I still find it fascinating that like 3 year, a couple years after being thrown into a compost pile, we have grape seeds germinating. But again, this shows you the power of just using a couple of basic local ingredients, local resources, especially one being a waste resource, which, and it took time and energy to go and collect them and bring them together and make the pile. But once I did that, I effectively ignored this pile until this year, planted some things, watered them in just a little bit as when they were young transplants, and this is what nature can do. I do think the wine blooms in that mix were key because they are very aggressive at turning wood chips and other material into soil. And what will happen is over the years, it will slowly diminish and just kind of settle down and keep composting. And so at that point, you could always you could kind of spread it out, build another one on top. And, in a perennial system, when you're looking 5 and 10 years down the road, you keep doing this, and within a decade, you're suddenly going to have, a 12-inch layer of rich organic soil on top of that subsoil. And the whole time getting mushrooms and vegetables and fruits and things like that out of it. So once again, hopefully can just inspire you to look around for local resources and see what you can do.
Stefan, I'm going to jump in and just say the connection to the wineries and the breweries is absolutely awesome. And so if anybody can, look around, there's probably one nearby. The other resource, we partner with White Winter Winery in Iron River, Wisconsin. And another, quote, waste product we get from them are their filter pads, because they have to filter their wine. And it's basically a paper mulch, like a 1/2-inch thick paper mulch that they filter their wine through, and they've just been throwing it away. We use it literally as a weed block mulch in our high intensity fruit crops. So we're planting Juneberries and elderberries. We're laying down these filter pads and then mulching on top of that with either wood chips or grass clippings, and it makes a fabulous weed suppression system. And then that pad, because it's a natural material, it'll decompose in about 2 to 3 years. Meanwhile, you're adding more mulch. So that's another resource that you can get that, they love it when we come and pick up a load of filter pads, because otherwise they're paying somebody to landfill it. So definitely look around your communities. It's amazing how many, quote, waste things are going to waste that you could be using in your projects.
Yeah, and especially up here in the North Shore, we've been talking a lot because we are recognizing that our regional landfill is actually getting close to capacity and may have to shut down. And once that happens, they're talking about shipping all waste that 4 hours or more south. And so that's where it's really important as well as we think about agriculture. Not only is it our fertility, but this is about like enhancing our community and taking care of our waste stream and turning it into a fertility stream. That's an awesome story, Cindy. I was not familiar with those as a byproduct.
Ask about their filter pads. I'm sure they're throwing them away.
Okay, I will. Okay. So now moving back to the vision one more time. And so the next big section that we'll talk about, and this is where we get into more serious earthworks that we've undertaken. And there's a lot of pictures and I'll kind of show you what we've been doing. But that is what I'm referring to as our Berm swale system, which is down here and here. It is currently complete. All 14 of these berms and swales have been dug out and made. And actually I'm in the process of planting the whole first wave of perennials into this top section here, because those were dug and started the process of soil regeneration. That would have been late fall 2017. So they went through two full seasons of soil regeneration. And as we see, we'll show you the cover crops here. This year, the cover crop clover cover crop was just amazing on it, which tells me that, okay, I feel good about putting perennials, which are a huge, investment in resources, both, time in terms of planting them, but also just the cost. So even though I know the bosses were really eager, to get perennials in, I put the brakes on and said, we're not going to do that until at least I feel okay about the soil we're putting them into. And so that's kind of the goal. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go here. So,
Stefan, one question that came up and I think is good to kind of hear. So you're building these berms, so you're creating physical structure. A question that came through was, would it be beneficial to allow poultry to scratch in that berm, or should they be kept out while you're kind of building the structure? Clearly later they could be integrated into your system. What are your thoughts on early, later, that kind of thing, integrating poultry?
Yeah, because I definitely believe I like poultry, and I think, and so we have a unique problem with this site because it's zoned residential. It's very complicated for us to even get any kind of animals on the land. But in general, I think poultry play a very critical role actually, I think animals in general play a very critical role in regenerating a landscape, and they offer so many different types of services. Now, yes, poultry can, they can sometimes tear apart things that you don't want them to tear apart. But I think that can be managed. And I think you can incorporate them at any point in that process that really makes sense to you. Because you know what? They will peck through for weed seeds. They will peck through for insects. They will leave their fertile droppings all over your landscape. And honestly, I do think that, ideally, like these berm systems, I would generally tend to use them once they've kind of matured a little bit more. But I think as I used cover crops to heal the soil, it would have been amazing to actually run flocks of chickens over the berms, let them eat those cover crops, turn them into eggs, and leave their droppings. So yeah, 100%, I think that's a great idea. Again, we just haven't used it because of our zoning complications with the land. Because again, remember, this is considered the heart of Finland. So here on the left, you're kind of seeing the land as when I first came in on spring of 2017, the greenhouse was up. Our deer fence was only partially up. This is our tamarack logs. So we got those on a semi, and basically because they bought them in bulk, tamarack logs, they're like 8-foot logs. They were like $1 a piece, which was pretty amazing price. And once you'll see it a little bit later, it's really beautiful on the landscape. But again, here you can see there's that hill that I was talking about. And here's one of the couple of different seepages or drainages. And in the spring, this stuff will practically flow like a river. So again, what we're trying to do is kind of capture that water and concentrate it. And that's why a pond system is really important, because we want to capture as much of that spring runoff and keep it on the landscape for diversity, for ecological health. But we did want to, if you were going to try to do any kind of agriculture on this land, we were going to have to change the landscape. So we took a pretty heavy-handed approach. Again, if this were more of a functional seasonal wetland in any way, shape, or form, I would suggest not to take the approach we took, because it is really heavy-handed. But again, this land had already had bulldozers on it, scraping all the topsoil off. The hydrology had effectively been destroyed. So that's in that sense, I feel okay about taking this approach, because we were actually going to add a lot of benefits to this landscape ecologically. So what we did, here's the summer 2017. So I basically used the same idea of Hugelkultur. As I cleared the land, these right here, I contoured everything with a laser level. I figured out the 2% drop I wanted. And these are all shrubs that are covered with a thick layer of grass. Like I cut the shrubs, laid them down on the contours. So it's like a Hugelkultur core of woody shrubs and also grass. We had a local excavator come in, and she basically dug out our trenches and dumped them on top of the berms. And yes, as I said, it's a heavy-handed and kind of ugly approach. And then all these berms were then leveled by hand with a shovel and a pickaxe. And let me tell you, that's a workout. We should have been charging for that, actually. And here you can see like the berm leveling. So they were leveled, and this is that same fall, and then cover cropped right away once they were leveled. And you can see all these rocks. Some of these were seriously the size of grand pianos. There's one that almost tipped her entire excavator over. But what we did is I just had her place them in the landscape, and they've stayed there. And you know what? Rocks in the landscape, once you get flowers and plants around them, again, this is the intention here, is an education center down the road, you know, where kids can come in and observe nature, you know, hang out on these rocks and just, you know, watch a bee on a flower, and, you know, whatever it is that the lesson would be on the day. But so this is kind of, you're starting to get a little bit more of the sense of the berms and the landscape and the vision. And again, basically, soil regeneration became vital because the soil was highly acidic. It was in the upper 4 level. And we did a soil test on the soil. Oh, what's that?
That's really acidic.
Yeah, and very acidic. And trying to find cover crops that would even grow in that was hard. But winter rye and vetch, both of those ended up doing really well, surprisingly well, in a highly acidic, nutrient-poor soil. We did a soil test on it, and it was lacking in pretty much most mineral nutrients. Again, because it was the subsoil. You know, they lost a lot of nutrients off the landscape when they scraped all the topsoil off. Which, by the way, they left in big piles at 2 points in the area, and one of them we spread out and we started gardening in. I've never, like, the fertility in that topsoil was amazing. I mean, the grass, we let the grass grow one season, and it was literally over my head. So that's over 6 foot tall grass in a single season. That was pretty impressive. I was like, wow, this is what the prairie must have looked like at one point. And so this is the very next year, summer 2018 and 2019. Basically, like, this would be 2018. This is what the rye and hairy vetch turned into. It was just amazing how well it grew on those horrible conditions. Now, oats did not do very well in here. They were very anemic. I stayed away from winter peas and field peas, which are known to not do well in acidic soils. Some types of clovers will do okay, but most of them kind of prefer more of a 5.5 pH level or above. And that's kind of the same with fruit trees too. It's like 5.5 is kind of that low end for a lot of fruit trees. They kind of, to my knowledge, they tend to prefer more around a 6 or higher. Is that your experience as well, Cindy?
Yeah.
And so what I was trying to do is basically grow biomass on the top and also the root biomass below the soil. So I was trying to create biomass both directions. So that's why I call this cover crop, mow, repeat. And so 2 to 3 times a year, I would mow it down, put down new cover crop, let those grow, mow it down, fall cover crop, overwinter it. Same thing in 2019. And just keeping a really heavy cycle on that land allowed me to, because every time you mow the crop down, most of the time you'll kill a lot of the cover crops, which means then they're living above ground biomass, creates a mat on the top of the soil, and their roots then start to decompose in the soil. And then the next round of cover crops comes in, and they use the pathways that were created before, and they extend upon them. And at the same time, they're pumping photosynthates into the soil, which is basically food for the soil life, whether bacteria, fungi, etc.
So Stefan, what were you using to cut or mow the grass? Was you using a scythe, a weed whacker?
I ended up using a weed whipper.
Okay.
And I did that. I tried a couple different things. I didn't like it, cutting it and then laying it down in sheets. So, whoops, what are you doing? So what I did is I used a weed whipper and basically just turned it into a mulch. It took some time, but I mean, I could mow an entire 100-foot berm down, I'd say in a 45 minutes to an hour when it's that big. So again, it's time, it takes time, but I like the mulch effect better because for one thing, it broke down faster on the top of the soil, and it all like once it dried, it then like what I would do, I would just broadcast seed the next cover crops, and right before like a good heavy rain, so then it would just kind of wash it down through the debris, and then as the debris kind of dried and desiccated, it would open up, and then the new cover crops would just emerge from underneath.
That's great.
Yeah. So, but you know, it's again, it takes time. That's 2 full years of doing that in a repeated cycle. And I did also add, after the soil test, I did add soil amendments. So I would kind of mix that into old potting soil from our greenhouse. And then every time I'd mow, I'd kind of sprinkle, I just walk the berms and kind of generally sprinkle it. And they would eventually just get kind of layered in between the mulch cycles. And it will, over time, work its way into the soil through this process of living in death, which is an important cycle. So just real quick, kind of talking about the soil regeneration process. So I used cover cropping. And again, all of this will be recorded. You can find it later, so I won't necessarily read through all this. But so the cover crops that I did use at the bottom there, I've used winter rye, hairy vetch, and tillage radish, which all did actually pretty good in the acidic soil. The oats and the clovers and the buckwheat didn't really do well until that second season, after I'd gotten a little bit of juice into that soil. But then like the turnips and the sunflower, the sun hemp and the sorghum, Sudan grass, and the phacelia in 2019, as that soil regeneration process really got going, those started showing up better. Whereas the first year, they basically just wouldn't even show up. They probably germinated and said, yeah, we're out of here. We'll come back next year. So it's interesting. That's one way to test your soil as it changes, by just watching which plants are doing better. And plants that don't like acidic soil, once they start appearing in the soil and start growing in your cover crop mix, it tells you that basic nature of your soil is changing.
What kind of weed problems did you have?
Not too many. So the grass, because the grass was just all dumped into those berm piles. So in some areas that grass has come back, but what I just tend to do is, it's interesting. It's only in patches. It hasn't really, it hasn't recolonized. In part, I think that's because of the heavy cover cropping mixes and the constant mowing. So the cover crops have kind of kept the grass at bay. Now, as I'm planting perennials, wherever I come across that kind of thick patches of grass, I plant my perennial in it, and then I just like mulch thick, like 3 inches thick of straw, just put it on top. And it's like, if you're planting into, a pasture and you're going to turn that into an orchard, it's kind of that same philosophy. Michael Phillips used this philosophy a lot in his orchard. He talks about, he uses wood chips, and how he just has this process of keep dumping wood chips on top of it whenever the grass starts to come through. And that over time, you're building up your soil, you're suppressing the weeds. The goal isn't to kill them all, it's just to suppress them and give the tree roots where they can outcompete the grass. So the other component was soil amendments. So after our soil tests, and I like rock minerals, because they're really stable. You don't get that soluble runoff into your waterways. And what you depend upon is basically biology to unlock the minerals in these the fertility. So, I would use like lime, I would use rock phosphate, green sand, boron, sulfur, and an azomite. And that was just kind of mixed in and spread over the fields and that's like, it's like you're filling your long-term savings account, which the future soil will slowly draw from and increase the fertility of the soil through, again, that cycle of nature, living and dying. But for kind of more of the quick fix, I also would add in some biological-based fertility. I would use alfalfa meal, kelp meal, and fishbone meal. It's expensive, so I didn't use it much, but I would, about once a year, I would kind of throw that on top of that mix as well. So it would just help add a little bit of extra. But again, mostly I focused on the rock minerals, because that's where we were really hurting in terms of that subsoil. And then, of course, I used liquid soil amendments. Bioferments, if you haven't done this, It's awesome, but it's also really, really stinky. So just make sure you know you know your neighbors well, or you hide it in the back part of your property. But I used a mixture of stinging nettles, comfrey, yarrow, kelp meal, and when I would weed, and I would just stuff 55-gallon barrels full, like pack them down, pour in water and blackstrap molasses, shut the lid, put a rock on top, and walk away for a month. And what comes, you're basically making a fermented tea with, in that process, it pulls all those nutrients out, and they're in a very soluble form. So that's another thing I would do, and I would kind of I would sprinkle that about once a year only, because again, it's a time-consuming process. So I would only do that once. Then I would also use a little bit of liquid fulvic and humic acids, which I just bought from an organic supplier. And those are natural byproducts of decomposing organic matter. And they're known, that's part of the beauty of compost, is they improve stress tolerance, water retention, and enhance chelating of plant nutrients. And so this year, the top left, you can see the clover was just bursting forth this spring. Wherever I saw asters and goldenrod kind of coming into the system, I would mow around them, because those are amazing late season plants for pollinators. And then I started planting. So these are the berms like earlier this year. They were mowed down after the cover crop, and then all the flags or all the perennials that went into that system. And these are the different types of perennials. This is what I call the Perennial Framework. Multiple types of berries, multiple types of fruit trees that I'm experimenting with. Like I'm doing 9 different varieties of apples, 9 different varieties of pears, several varieties of cherries, a couple apricots. They said they're zone 3. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's like, yeah, but then again, that's part of our mission, is to trial things. We're research around perennial fruits for the area, especially with the changing climate. We don't know what's going to happen in 10, 15 years when these trees are maturing. But we are also trialing on commercial level. We're trialing out 4 varieties of kind of a more commercial hazelnut and 10 varieties of elderberry. And of course, just throwing in all kinds of comfrey. If you're not familiar with comfrey, it's a hybrid that I use, so it does not spread by seed. True comfrey will spread by seed and can become a nightmare very quickly. But the hybrid, it doesn't spread that way. It's got infertile seeds. But I love comfrey. It's an amazing soil builder. You can just keep cutting it and either making the fermented tea, or you can just lay it on the soil as a great way to spread nutrients around your berms. And so that's kind of a beautiful image of it there. So that you can see the berm cover crops were in full flower. I think this was late last summer. And this is kind of we had a drone this year, so you can kind of see how the design is playing out. And this is, it's kind of, everything feels a little yellow, because again, I do water the berms, but it's been a very, very dry year. And so everything's kind of had a yellowish tinge to it around here. Okay, and this is kind of wrapping up that kind of component. Like, this is kind of what the North Shore AgroEcology Center is growing into, looking at small scale, intensive, and regenerative farms and homesteads for the Northeast Minnesota region, especially with our forested, acidic soils, and also trying to really keep in mind that commercial component. How can different operations maybe take 1 or 2 of these elements and then build a system around them? So, looking at the herbal medicines or commercial elderberry production, commercial hazelnut production, fruits and berries, the deep winter greenhouse, vegetables and seeds. We're doing some seed varietal trials and starting to work with a local group of people who are saving seeds for this region. Bees, mushrooms, willows for basketry. So all of these are being incorporated into our design. Perhaps on a homestead scale, you might try to incorporate multiple of these, or if you're more of a farm, you might pick a couple of these items that you would then take and expand into a single system, and with a strong mind towards making money in a commercial operation. And this is also where we feel like the Finland food chain comes in as we work towards creating a producing and cooperative. We could actually have several small scale commercial elderberry producers up here, each with maybe an acre or two, but by bringing them all together, then we can become a regional, a stronghouse for producing elderberry production. And elderberries there's a high demand for elderberries, and it's a growing crop within the United States. Same with hazelnuts. But I think the research and development for commercial hazelnuts is still in process. The U of M, the University of Wisconsin, both are doing a lot of work on that, trying to get hazelnut production as a new up-and-coming agroforestry for the upper Midwest. But yeah, as I mentioned, we're also doing mushroom cultivation on site. We have, these are the different mushrooms that have been sprinkled into the system. Oysters mostly, just because we have lots of aspen around, but I've done a little shiitake, peelpini, otherwise known as black poplar, which is kind of a delicacy over in Italy. Turkey tail for, I think of more for medicine, but someone was just telling me the other day they love eating them. Wine cap mushrooms, agaricus, which is a close relative of portobello mushrooms and grows actually on compost. And bluefoot is another one that kind of grows in mulch. But we're doing those on logs, stumps, wood chips, spent coffee grounds. We're also running a very beginning with bees. First goal is to try to get bees to live through our winters up here. Some years local beekeepers have success. 2 years ago, I think almost everybody lost all their bees. It was a harsh winter. But I've experimented with carniolans, Italians, and the new one is the saskatraz, which this last winter I went into with 3 hives, 2 saskatraz, 1 carniolan. Both saskatraz came through. They were actually developed up in Canada, and they came through the winter strong and crazy powerful. I was so excited, and then came the bear.
Oh, bad bear.
Bad bear. We've had some really high bear activity in the area this year. They've been mischievous. And unfortunately, I'd gotten 2 new hives, ripped them all apart. And I was out there, you know, if you've got bees, you know what that feels like. I was sick for a week. I felt like somebody had just punched me in the stomach repeatedly. But I did go out there, and if you've never had the chance to pick up a hive after a bear attack, wow, it's an experience. But I managed to scrape together a bunch of bees into 1 hive, had no idea if there was a living queen in that mass, and walked away and came back 2 weeks later and went in, and there was a living queen laying eggs. And I was like, hallelujah. So those saskatrazes are some serious bees.
Wow.
And the bear has not been back. I have refortified my defenses.
Electric fencing, right?
Yes, very powerful electric fencing. Yeah, so, and then one last component, and then we'll try to open it up for the few questions. We're about 8 to 3 right now. But the other big component that we have on site, again, is the deep winter greenhouse. This is a more expensive tool that we put in conjunction with the University of Minnesota. They put 5 of these in around the state to test them as an idea. It was a highly engineered and very expensive tool. I do believe that there's a lot of good ideas here. I also think that you could bring that price down and design a much cheaper tool. Might not be quite as effective, but I think I do think there's a lot of room for improvement and for like a small scale producer to build these items. The big problem we have found is basically it's designed as a solar engine. And we have had some really cloudy winters here on the North Shore. And so in that sense, we've tried to go without using any kind of additional light system. But we found that we've actually really needed to, because we've gone weeks at a time without a single day of sun up here. Whereas down in Madelia, they have another one of these, which is in southern Minnesota, and they get a lot more sun, and theirs is showing much more positive results. But basically they work really well with minimal backup heat. it's been 20 below outside, and if we have sunny days, it gets up to about upper 70s, low 80s inside during the day, and at night it stays above 40. And basically it's designed with a rock bed underneath and a recirculating bathroom fan that just moves air through the rock bed, back through the high tunnel, through the rock bed, and just circulates all day long. So it warms up the rocks during the day, cools, and then pulls that heat back out of the rocks at night. So it is a really effective tool as long as you get sufficient daylight. You can think of it as like a battery, and your battery needs to get recharged. And then that's just the beauty of the things we've harvested in the greenhouse. And my ladybug friends, love my ladybug friends.
What's that thing in the top left? Well, my left.
That is turmeric. So what I've done in the summer is I plant the ginger and turmeric, which are great because I'm so busy, I don't have time to deal with anything in the greenhouse. But they're tropical plants, and they just love the extra heat in there in the summer. So that's a turmeric root I dug up last fall. Yeah, so I've got the turmeric and the ginger going again this summer. So yeah, like this salad mix went to the Wolf Ridge Educational Center for a big event they were having. I think this was probably late February. So that's the beauty of this, getting local fresh greens with flowers on it nonetheless in late February in Finland. And then I use the control aphids, which are kind of a bugger in this system. I love to use ladybugs. Mm-hmm. So, let's see, and I think that's all. Any questions that you want to throw at us in the last 5 minutes?
So, somebody was asking, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do with all the produce that you harvest at this time? Who's it distributed to? That kind of stuff.
So the produce from the greenhouse, and that's our main area of produce. I haven't focused on much outdoor production because we've had very limited staff. And once you start producing in the summer, that's a lot of time processing, delivering. I focus in the summer more on the earthworks and getting the soil ready. In the winter, all of our greens go. We have a local co-op here in town. It's kind of like a general store co-op. It's actually the oldest running co-op in Minnesota. So the first couple of years, we actually just donated that to the co-op so that to help the local population become familiar with this idea. And then this last year, we actually started selling it to the co-op, but on consignment. So they wouldn't, if it didn't sell, we would just take it back. But we found that the local desire for produce in the middle of the winter far outstripped what our little greenhouse could actually produce. We'd bring about every 3 or 4 days, about 10 bags down, and those would usually be gone within 24 hours. So it's, and again, as you could tell from the pictures, it's a postage stamp. But in a lot of the additional produce as we move down the road, we will look at, we're developing an online food co-op for the region. So we would probably sell through that down the road. And as we have events and more workshops, we'll take the produce and use it to feed people that come to the AgroEcology Center. But definitely the main focus at this point is the local community. So it's hyper local. Any other questions?
We've got just a couple more minutes if anybody has some last minute questions for Stefan. I had a question. You talked about wood chips a lot. Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons? What kinds of wood chips? Were they hardwood, softwood, advantages, disadvantages?
Ideally for, if you're going to use them for like the mushroom components and add in like the wine cap mushrooms, hardwood are ideal. So some of our wood chips, we had a wood chipper, kind of an industrial scale wood chipper for a couple of years. And so we would harvest as we thinned out our woods to kind of open up space for our sugar maples. We used those, and that was a lot of ash and some some aspen, but mostly that was a lot of ash that invaded there. We wanted to open it up because we identified like 80 sugar maple trees in our woods that we wanted to open up. Now the softwoods tend to be more acidic. They also tend to, people tend to claim that they have more issues, like fungi don't like them, which is true. They tend to have more of a antifungal component to them. And now that from the other stuff I read, after a few years, that kind of starts to break down. So in my piles, sometimes I've used what I know are hardwood chips. Sometimes I've grabbed from a big community pile, which I really have no idea what's in there. And the mushrooms do fine in that as well. So, it's generally speaking, like they suggest you stay away from doing any kind of hugelkultur with coniferous woods. Unless, of course, you want to hugelkultur like, blueberries or, cranberries or something like that where they like the acidity. But, yeah.
Cool.
Okay, and I think that puts us, boom, 3 o'clock.
Right there, boom, the mothership just clicked over to 3 o'clock. We appreciate all of you for attending. Hannah, I know you and a couple other people showed up a little late, but like I said, this is being recorded and it'll be available so you can view it at your viewing pleasure in the future at the Finland Food Chain website. And it'll be a week or so, but it'll get out there.
Also on our Facebook page. I think we'll make
Facebook page.
We'll make sure it gets cross-posted there.
Yeah.
And again, if you have any questions, you can certainly feel free to email me at either one of my hats, even at my Sasquatch hat.
Oh, I was like, yeah, what is that? Oh, your Sasquatch. Okay. Got it. All right.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday afternoon. And if you have any extra rain in your area, please send it our way.
Okay, we'll do our best.
Get out of here, rain. Go up there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Cindy.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.